Thank you, Leslie. Jack, I want to start by thanking you. And one thing I learned is that the most brilliant people come out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I understand that's where you're from. We have that connection. So I hope to talk to you a little bit about Pittsburgh down the road. But thank you for hosting this. I think this is a great opportunity. I'm really honored to be able to introduce my close friend, James Forman. James and I started as public defenders together 1 year apart here in D.C., D.C. Public Defender Service. And I remember as young lawyers, we would try to find ways to stay inspired as we did this hard work. And we'd get together at someone's house over pizza and beers, and we'd talk about what motivated us to do this work. And I remember coming out of law school, I was motivated because I really believed that when the power of the government came after an individual, there should be someone to stand up for them. That it was about fighting back against an oppressive, powerful government. James would say, I do this work because it's civil rights work. I've always wanted to do civil rights work. And I remember being a young public defender, and I didn't quite see this as civil rights work. I thought, well, that's great, but we're not really doing housing law or voting rights. 10 years later, I got invited to move to Georgia to be the first training director for Georgia's statewide public defender system. After a couple of years helping with the reform effort in Georgia, Katrina hit, and I was invited to come to New Orleans to help rebuild that public defender office. I did some work in Alabama and Mississippi, and I started to really understand something, James, that you said 10 years earlier. That really the struggle for criminal justice is today's greatest civil rights struggle. I started to understand that public defenders were more than just lawyers who did work in courtrooms, in discrete cases for discrete individuals, but that collectively public defenders speak for 80% of the people in the system. Collectively, public defenders are the vehicle through which voiceless people get a voice. And if we disrespect and under-resource public defenders, those people don't have a voice. One of the most iconic photographs from the civil rights movement, for me, is that photograph from 1968, Memphis, Tennessee, sanitation workers taking to the streets with a basic sign saying, I am a man, right? Basically saying, just see me as a human being. And I think we like to think that's history, but if we think about people today protesting in the streets with banners that say Black Lives Matter, aren't they really saying the same thing? Just see me as a human being. And I think what I really learned from James, and continue to learn from our relationship with people like James, is that if we're not giving voice to people who are deemed expendable, we can't really get to where we need to be in this criminal justice arena. So Illy and I, with the help of many people in this room, built Gideon's Promise, not just to train public defenders to be the best lawyers in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and increasingly across the country, but to build a movement, a community, an army of advocates to give folks voice. So James Forman and I started our work together 10 years ago. I like to think we continue it to this day. James was visionary back then. James understood public defenders as more than just lawyers in the courtroom when he and Dave Domenici started a school largely catering to court-involved kids called See Forever. And there were some kids I worked with, and they were some of the first members of that school. James continues to do his work in education. He now has gone on to be a law professor, but he's never really been one to stand up and say, I need to be at a podium sort of lecturing high thoughts. James really understood this work as a way to work with future lawyers and future advocates to train them to be the advocates we need to realize a world that our children, my children, all of our children deserve. And James wrote a book, and I think what's so amazing about this book, and I'm so honored, James, that you came to DC to talk about it, because what James tells us in this book is that sometimes people who are really well-intentioned can get shaped by a tough-on-crime narrative and end up, without even realizing it, contributing to mass incarceration, contributing to widespread civil rights abuses. And James reminds us how that's happened and urges us to recognize that, to not sleepwalk through this system, to be better. And so, James, thank you for coming. I'm honored. I can't wait to hear you talk.
Thank you, Rep. I appreciate it. I appreciate those words. Illy, thank you for putting this thing together. Leslie, thank you for organizing. Jack, thank you for sponsoring this event. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be here. I thought that what I would do to start out with, picking up on John's theme of this work as civil rights work, I thought I would talk a little bit about my book, tell you about my motivations for writing it, and then at the end talk a little bit about our collective work, the work that Gideons Promise is trying to support, and the work that you all are supporting in terms of how we respond to this human rights crisis that has been created on our watch. So we all had different motivations for being public defenders. I'll tell you a little bit about mine. And I'll tell you through a story of a young man that I've represented, one of my clients by the name of Brandon. And Brandon was a teenage client of mine, 15 years old, Superior Court, Washington, D.C. And he had been charged with and pled guilty to possession of a gun and small amount of marijuana. It was an exceedingly common, typical case. And Brandon was facing sentencing. And I was his lawyer. I had been appointed to represent him. And I had taken the job of being a public defender because I viewed it as the civil rights work of my generation. My parents met in SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They met in the original civil rights movement. My dad is black, my mom is white. So they're an interracial couple at a time when those marriages are illegal in many states in this country. And their generation, Wade Henderson, transformed this nation. They made it possible for me to have opportunities that were unimaginable in my parents' generation. I mean, theirs was the generation that faced down Bull Connor's dogs, that marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that went to D.C. 250,000 strong for the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. Their generation produced the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68. I mean, they'll teach you in school that Congress passed those laws, the president signed them, and that's true, but don't kid yourself. The only reason any action was taken was because people marched and people fought, people protested and people demanded. And they did that. And yet and still, with all the change that they had created, I could see when I was graduating from law school that there was unfinished business to the civil rights movement. And the place that I saw it, and I'm not saying it's the only place, the place that I saw it was in our criminal legal system. I use the term criminal justice less and less because it's hard to say that that system deserves the word justice, but in our criminal legal system. When we started at PDS, that's a term that was created in the year 2000 by advocates and activists to describe this phenomenon. But we already knew, even though we didn't have the term, we had some of the numbers. We already knew 1 in 3 young black men under criminal justice supervision. We knew that black women were the largest single growing part of the prison system. We knew that the United States had passed Russia and South Africa to earn the dishonor of being the world's largest jailer. We knew that we had 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. And I had seen some of the changes in American society that produced those numbers. I had seen them in my own life. So John was talking about Pittsburgh. All greatness eventually makes its way to Atlanta. I grew up in Atlanta. I grew up in my neighborhood, the very end of Boulevard. My neighborhood growing up, there were 2 huge institutions 2 blocks from my home. If you walked either way, one way was a General Motors plant. 2 blocks the other way was the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. That's when I was a kid. Now, when I was graduating from law school, deciding what I was going to do with my career, one of those buildings had shut down, padlocked, jobs shipped overseas. Another building, the other one, had built an addition, an extra wing. And I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room which is which, but if you drive down Boulevard, you will still see the Federal Penitentiary. That reality, wanting to fight that system, brought me into Superior Court, Washington, D.C., standing next to Brandon. I was asking for him to be put on probation. I had a letter from a teacher and a counselor at his school. His mother and grandmother were there in court. They were there in the front row. Please come in. Please come in. Get some food. They were there in the front row. They had been there for every court hearing. They were asking for him to come home. The prosecutor in the case wanted him to go to Oak Hill. Now, Oak Hill is like, y'all know the story of Oak Hill, but Oak Hill is like so many places around this country, juvenile facilities. It has a nice sounding name. Right? An oak tree on a hill. What could be more lovely, combined with a brutal reality? Drugs and violence rampant. No programs. See, you go down there, you talk to the city hall, they'll say, oh, we have this and that. You go there, you see it's not there. It was a place where, as a young person, you always left out worse off than when you entered. The judge had to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker. And I changed the names of all the judges. I changed the names of all the lawyers. I changed, of course, the names of all my clients to protect their identity. So Judge Walker's not his real name, but he's a real judge. Some of you know him. He's an African-American judge, Superior Court bench at the time. That wasn't unusual, 40% African-American. So Judge Walker's looking out at Brandon, and he looks at him, and he says, son, Mr. Forman's been telling me that you've had a tough life. You deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough, son. Let me tell you about Jim Crow segregation. Judge had been a child in those years. He proceeds to lecture Brandon on what that was like. And then he says, so here's the thing. People fought. People marched. People died for your freedom. Dr. King died for you. And I'll tell you this. He didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on, embarrassing your family, embarrassing your community, carrying that gun. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope one day you turn it around. But today, in this courtroom, actions have consequences. Your consequence is Oak Hill. Lock him up. I was so angry and frustrated that day. I mean, think about it. The judge had taken the same history that I just told you motivated me to become a defender. He invoked the same decade, the same heroes, in a twisted moral rationale for why it made sense to lock up Brandon. And over the years after that experience, and I had others like it, I began to wrestle with and try to work through my anger. And I'm still in process on that. But as I did, I began to think about the fact that, the judge was not alone. I told y'all 40% of the judges, Superior Court, African American. That's just the beginning. The police force was majority black. The police chief at the time was African American. The mayor was black. The city council that passed the gun and the drug laws that Brandon was being sentenced under was a majority African American city council. The chief prosecutor in the city at the time was none other than Eric Clarke, long before he would become known nationally. And even with all that representation in our local government and in our local court system, we were passing the same laws, we were making the same policy decisions, we were doing the same thing in this city as was happening in the rest of the country, with the same results. I told you 1 in 3 young black men nationally was under criminal justice supervision. In D.C., at the time, it was 1 in 2. And so for me, I had to wrestle with this question of what happened in this country over the last 50 years? What was so powerful? What was so all-consuming? What logics got taken for granted? Such that even in a majority black community with some measure of control of our local criminal legal system, we were producing the same results. And that question is the question of the book. I'm not going to try to answer that whole question in this time we have over lunch, because I know y'all are busy. I'm just going to mention a couple of points along the way that I think are crucial. And I think mentioning those points is important for setting the stage for then the question of, well, what do we do in response? So the first thing that we have to grapple with is rising crime and violence and the fear and the anger that it created in many communities, but in African American communities in this country over the last 50 years, but especially in 2 decades, the crack years of the 80s and early 90s and the heroin years of the 1960s. And I'm going to say something about the heroin years because they're less well known than the 1980s. The homicide rate in this country doubled in the 1960s. It tripled in D.C. Heroin did damage to black communities like what crack would do 2 decades later. They tested everyone entering the D.C. jail for substances every year. In 1963, they found that 4% of the people entering the jail were heroin addicts. That was in 1963. By 1969, the 4% had become 45%. And it wasn't just, though, the numbers, it was the response. So to write the book, you looked at local archives, libraries all around D.C., GW, Howard, Martin Luther King branch of the D.C. library system. And I came across letters. Some elected officials kept the letters that they had received from citizens. So it's this amazing social history of a city. This is the 1970s now. Majority black city, 70% African American at the time, and the first home rule city council in D.C. that's elected in 1975, 11 out of 13 members are African American. So these are mostly black citizens writing to mostly black elected officials. And they're saying, we just fought the civil rights movement, and what's happening? I can't even take my kids to school, I'm so scared. They're selling drugs on the corner, they're shooting in the park. They're saying, I feel like a prisoner in my own home, I feel like a stranger on my own city streets. And then these letters end with some version of, do something, you have to do something about it. Now, who's receiving these letters? That's the second big argument in the book. The generation of people who are receiving these letters is the first generation of black elected officials to be elected in any number in this country since Reconstruction. In the 1970s and 1980s, we get an 800% increase in black elected officials nationwide. It's because of the Voting Rights Act of 65. Now, it's an 800% increase over almost zero, but it's an 800% increase. And this generation, what do we know about them? Many of them are from the South. Some of them were in the Civil Rights Movement. All of them remember the long history of under-enforcement and under-protection of the law that has been part of the black experience in this country since slavery. They remember, my dad used to tell me about this, they remember Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan. They were asked about a homicide in a black neighborhood. They said, that's not a homicide, that's another dead black person. And they didn't use the words black person. My dad used to talk to me about, he grew up in south side of Chicago in Jim Crow, Mississippi. He said, we didn't call the police in a black neighborhood when there was a crime. The police weren't going to come investigate a black victim. And if they did, the only thing you could be sure of is that they were going to leave matters worse than how they found them. So they know this history, and now they're in office, and they have some amount of control, and they want to try to make this law enforcement apparatus respond to those black citizens who are asking for protection. Okay, crime is rising, violence is rising, there's a generation of officials, at least some of them, have this racial justice approach. They want to respond, but why police and prosecutors? Why is that the response? And here's where my story, which is fundamentally a story about the choices that black elected officials made and that their citizens were asking for, also becomes a story about the larger constraints and the larger structures that limited the options that was available. So let me tell you about a couple of those constraints. The first one is historical. Black elected officials, because of a history of racism and slavery and white supremacy, because of that history, they're representing communities that don't have the resources to defend themselves. So because, remember, we had slavery in this country for longer than we haven't. And I'm not talking about metaphorical. I'm talking about actual 1619 to 1865 is longer period of time than 1865 to the present. And now if you add Jim Crow and segregation to that, that's 85% of American history, with established racism in law. And that manifested itself in decisions about housing, in decisions about wealth discrimination, in the fact that black homeowners couldn't get loans to improve their houses so their families don't have the wealth that they need, decisions about discriminatory application of government resources like the GI Bill, so black soldiers go and serve and then can't get the benefit when they return, discriminatory decisions about where we build our federal highways. We built a massive federal highway system in this country in the 1950s and 1960s. We take it for granted. Who's driven through Atlanta? You driven on I-85 or I-75 if you've driven through Atlanta. Now, you probably don't know. Atlanta's crazy. It's like 13 lanes, and each year I go back, it's another lane. You don't know it, but you are driving through what was once called the Black Wall Street. Auburn Avenue, Dr. King was raised there, thriving, historic black community, destroyed by the federal highways. These government decisions accumulated over centuries, impoverished these neighborhoods which these elected officials were then elected to represent. Second constraint is political. The people that I'm writing about are local elected officials because that's where black political power is concentrated. And local elected officials matter, but there are limits to what local government can do. Black elected officials, I argue, for the last 50 years have had what I call all of the above strategy to fighting crime and violence. They've said we want more money for police and prosecutors, and unfortunately sometimes they've said we want more money for prisons, but they've also said we want more money for housing. We want more money for health care, for jobs, for education, for mental health treatment, for drug treatment. They've said we want national gun control to go alongside this local gun control we're passing. They've said we want a Marshall Plan for urban America. We want the United States government to do for black communities what it did for Europe after World War II, to rebuild, to reinvest, to revitalize. For 50 years they march up to Congress asking for money for all of the above. And for 50 years they've been coming back with money for one of the above: law enforcement, police and prosecutors. Last constraint that I'll mention, and I end here because it's a constraint we're still suffering from to this day. And it's one of the most important things that we try to liberate ourselves from. This is a generation of people who are constrained by their imaginations in terms of how to respond to what were real and pressing and genuine problems. So there's a lot of examples of this in the book, but let me just give you one. In honor of Judge Milliken, 1975. First city council. I told y'all that 11 of 13 members were African American. Well, one of the two members white members was David Clarke. Now, David Clarke was a lot of things. What I want you to know about him for right now is he was not a drug warrior. He was the opposite of that. He had a fascinating bio. He went to Howard Law School in the 1960s, works for Dr. King, becomes a lawyer for poor people, gets elected to city council. Now he's on the city council. The first thing he does in 1975 is introduces a marijuana decriminalization bill. The same law that passed in this city in 2014, David Clarke introduced in 1975. Couldn't get it passed. It was a close vote. That's the story of chapter 1 of my book. But the thing to know is he's not a drug warrior. Okay, so now it's the early 80s. He's the chair of the city council. And heroin, remember I told you about heroin? It kind of stepped back in the 70s, and now it's the early 80s. It's back in force, increasing in strength and toxicity, and the overdose deaths are rising. And David Clarke is being deluged with letters from citizens saying you got to do something about these heroin addicts. They're saying, and I don't endorse this language, but it's what the letter said, you know, there's these junkies, and they're gathering on our stoop and on our corners, and they're sleeping on the park benches, and they're leaving dirty syringes in the alleys, and you got to do something about it. Now, David Clarke gets these letters, and he's a good, responsible public official. He forwards them to the head of the relevant government agency. And then he gets a letter back. Councilmember Clarke received your citizen complaint about heroin addicts. We're on the case. That's good. But who does he forward them to? Remember, the problem is heroin addicts in public space. That's the problem. Does he forward them to the head of the Department of Mental Health, Addiction Services, Public Health, Social Work? He's not a drug warrior, but he's an American, and he's constrained by his imagination. So he can only imagine the police department as being the place that you would turn to. He can only imagine sending somebody who's got handcuffs and a gun, and whose only place they can take you for treatment, where there is none, is the local jail. And so that's what he does. And the argument of my book, John alluded to this, the argument of my book is that to understand what has happened in this country over the last 50 years, and to figure out how we're going to have to respond, it's important to look at acts of Congress and speeches by the president. But it is just as important, fundamentally important, to look at the individual decisions that have been made by many individuals, some of them well-intentioned, small choices hidden behind government walls and agencies out of the public view, these small choices like which agency do I ask for help when citizens write me to ask about a heroin problem? Those individual decisions, I argue, are the individual bricks that collectively have built the prison walls, the prison nation that America has become. Now, that's a gloomy tale, but fortunately, we have an organization here and leaders here who are doing something in response to that. And so I want to spend just the last couple of minutes talking about what we can do in response to the problem that I just identified. Because things have changed in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years. There is a new generation of activists at the local level and some of them at the national level who are raising these concerns in a way that wasn't true. There were individual people, but it wasn't at this volume 10, 20 years ago. There are legislators in many states that have reduced our prison population by 20% in Connecticut, in Florida, in California, in Texas, and in New York, and during that time have seen crime keep going down. So don't believe people when they tell you if you reduce the prison population, then crime is going to go up. We now have a decade's worth of historical evidence that that's not true. We now have groups of people in Florida who successfully got 1.4 million people re-enfranchised, the largest restoration of citizenship rights in this country since the Voting Rights Act happened 2 weeks ago in that election. We have in Louisiana, so I'm picking the toughest on crime states, y'all, for you to see the point. In Louisiana, they passed a voter referendum to require unanimous juries. Louisiana had been one of 2 states in the country where you could be convicted with a non-unanimous jury. So things are changing, but they're not changing fast enough. And the change won't become entrenched. The change will be temporary. The change will be susceptible of reversing back in the other direction unless public defenders become a central part, and empowering public defenders become a central part of the reform agenda. And so far, it hasn't been. It hasn't been enough. And partially, I'll take responsibility for that. I and my colleagues, this is a point that John has been making for a number of years, and he credited me for educating him on something. I have to credit him for educating me on something. A lot of the law professors who study the criminal legal system in our law schools are from PDS, which is fabulous. But one of the mistakes and blinders that has imposed upon us is that we all practice in a system where one of the few things that really did work well was the indigent defense. And so we haven't experienced the daily grind of the 3 and 4 and the 500 cases and the judges that tell you can't file a motion. So we haven't, when we talk about what we need to do to fix the system, we haven't given fixing indigent defense and empowering public defenders, we haven't given that enough its due because we've kind of taken that for granted. But what John and Illy and the lawyers that they're working with are showing us is that we can't take it for granted. Just think about some of the reforms that have gotten a lot of attention lately. Let me just give you 2. Bail reform, right? Become a big national issue where people are pushing to move away from this reflexive bail schedules where it doesn't matter how much money you have, the judge is just putting this much amount of money on the table, and then poor people are getting locked up, and electing progressive prosecutors, right? There's been a whole movement, and I endorse it, and I talk about it in Georgia, in Alabama, in Florida, in Texas, in Denver, in Chicago, in Philadelphia most famously. Progressive reformer prosecutors getting elected, right? These are important. But understand that those reforms won't actually make a difference in the lives of our clients without excellent public defenders. How do we know this? Well, just think about it. If you don't have a automatic bail schedule, if it's not just automatic, well, you get $2,000, $10,000, $50,000, the judge still has to make a decision. Who's going to be the person in court that's standing up and say, Your Honor, right now what you heard from the government was just this charge. But let me tell you about my client. Let me tell you about her family. Let me tell you about her children. Let me tell you about her hopes, her dreams. Let me tell you about all these times that she reported to court when she was told to report to court. Let me tell you about how the fact that she doesn't have this money. The only person that's going to be able to raise that up is a hard-working, aggressive, informed public defender. So you can have all the bail reform in the world, but if you don't have empowered public defenders, your incarceration rates pre-trial aren't going to change. Progressive prosecutors, even more the point. I had a conversation with Larry Krasner about this in my classroom a month ago. He's probably the most well-known of this new generation of reform-minded prosecutors. And I like him a lot. And I think he's making a big difference. But understand what he has now empowered his prosecutors to do. He has empowered his prosecutors to give real meaningful plea offers when they used to just push for the max. He's empowered his prosecutors to dismiss cases when appropriate. How are his prosecutors going to know when a case should be dismissed or when somebody deserves that lower plea offer or that probation? The prosecutors aren't meeting with the individuals who are charged. They still are working off the same facts that they've always worked off of. The charging document and the police report. Well, they have more power now, right? They have more discretion. But if that's all they have, they're never going to exercise that discretion in favor of leniency because the police report doesn't have the mitigating facts. The police report doesn't show our clients in their wholeness, in their fullness. The only way they're going to be able to be the reformers that they have been elected to be is with excellent public defenders that are raising up the voice of the accused and who are telling that story every day. Now that's in the places where the reform movement has made progress. And what about in some of the places where judges are still doing the same things that they've always done? In those places, we need empowered public defenders just as much. Think about Bryan Stevenson's famous quote that so many of us, live by. This idea that nobody is their worst act. Right? Nobody should be judged by the single worst thing that they've done. That's inspirational to me. Okay, but if you're not going to be judged by the worst thing you've ever done, then implicit in that is you're going to be judged by the rest of who you are. But how's the court system ever going to know the rest of who you are? If not for a public defender with motivation and commitment and resources to investigate and to bring the rest of who you are to court, to bring the wholeness of your humanity to the courtroom, a courtroom that is almost set up to deny it. So public defenders in these places are the people that provide context, are the people that humanize our clients. They are the people that stand up to a courtroom and a system that is about processing bodies, right? And moving the calendar. Got to move the calendar, counsel. Well, we're the one people in the system that we don't care about moving the calendar. That's the judge's objective, the prosecutor. Everybody in the courtroom might care about moving the calendar. We don't. But if we're not there to fight that momentum, then bodies are just going to keep getting processed and calendars are going to keep getting moved and we are going to keep having the largest prison system in the history of the world. So it's got to be us. It's on us. It's on defenders. It's on people like those Gideon's promise lawyer that I read about recently in Louisiana. All right, this lawyer was in a system where that they were told, well, you don't file motions in this courtroom. We don't file motions. You take this good deal. And the lawyer said, the lawyer was a Gideon's lawyer. The lawyer said, no. I'm filing a motion to challenge the nature of the way my client was even brought to court. And the choice by the lawyer to do that required, it was a long shot, but it required the prosecutor to just at a minimum go find the file. Right? They had to at least find the file to respond to the motion. But they couldn't. They couldn't find the file overnight, so when they get to court the next day, they have to dismiss the case. Well, think about it. This system was ready to have somebody plead guilty and maybe lock them up when they had no file. Everyone was prepared to do that, but for the Gideon's promised lawyer. Think about the Gideon's lawyer in Texas, who was told by a judge, counsel, your problem is you overwork your cases. No, seriously. That was the statement by the judge. I mean, on the record. You overwork your cases. And the Gideon's lawyer was like, well, what I do is I represent my clients, and their cases require work. And this lawyer did this at great risk. It meant that this judge would cut them off from getting future appointments. Other judges in the courthouse would cut them off from getting future appointments. And it got so bad that the Civil Rights Corps now had to file a lawsuit in support of, and this lawsuit is going to shine a light on these practices of these judges. And when that light is shined, then citizens can go to the polls, as they just did in Texas in this last election, and vote out some of these judges that were taking the proposition that lawyers should overwork their cases. But citizens can't move, right? That all started with a Gideon's promised lawyer who said, overwork my cases? I represent people. Nothing that happened since would have happened without that lawyer holding the system's barbarity up to the light. Last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll stop, is one thing that gives me a lot of inspiration that when I think about Gideon's promise, and that I just want to leave John and Illy with, and Aliyah and Lucas, who I think they're part of the Gideon's promise leadership, because they have to put up with, I mean, just look at it. They got to be put up. I mean, I know we think we're wonderful, but they got to be dragged to lunches. They have their parents going on travel to try to fight injustice, and I know what that's like as a child of civil rights workers. I know that's real when you have a lot of other people who are asking for your parents' time. And sometimes you're just like, can we just be a normal family and like all be together for dinner? And one of the things that I kind of keep with me is a conversation I had with my dad. It was a couple years right here in D.C., lived up in Adams Morgan, small apartment. It was a couple years before he passed away. And we had watched a movie about the civil rights movement. And the movie ended, and I said, what'd you think about it? You were there. And he said, I liked the movie. I liked that they showed this history in film because more people watch films than read books, which I probably should have thought about. but that's not the main point of the story. The point is what he went on to say, which was, the one thing I didn't like about this movie is I didn't like the way they made it seem like everybody was in the movement. And he said it wasn't like that. We were unpopular. I couldn't recruit kids to join the movement because their parents didn't want them to leave college. We venerate now the kids that left college and joined the movement. But parents didn't want them to do that. He said Martin Luther King was unpopular when he died. He had 2/3 unpopular rating. There was a Gallup poll, favorable or unfavorable. Dr. King's favorability ratings were lower than our current president's at the time of his death. The March on Washington was unpopular. 2 months before the March on Washington, the same march that's like the totality of the Black History Month curriculum these days? That march, 60% of Americans said that they thought the march was not going to help the cause of the Negro. That's a month before Now 250,000 people went, which is a big number, but a decade later, 10 million people would say they were there. So what's that about? This is what my dad was saying. He said, listen, I don't want credit for I'm not trying to get credit for like we were there first. That's not the point. He said, what I don't like about the way the movement is portrayed in the media is that it's demoralizing to future generations. Because when they're doing their social justice work and their advocacy, and they have 6 people at the meeting, or 12 people at the meeting, and 11 of them were at the previous meeting, they're like, well, what's wrong with my cause? Because the movement, everybody got it. But that's not how it happened. And so what my dad was saying is that when you are facing a profound and apparently insurmountable injustice like slavery or Jim Crow, or I would say in this generation mass incarceration, people will tell you that change is impossible. But then, and only if you ignore them and you create the change, those same people that told you it was impossible will turn around and say, oh, that was inevitable. And then they'll make a movie about it. So I don't know the idea that is going to come out of this generation. It might be an idea from Lucas and from Aliyah. I don't know who the group of people is that is going to put this idea into practice, but I think that the idea is in part in this room, and Gideon's promise, I think, is part of it. And so what I want to say is that there's going to be a point in time where they make a movie, another movie, because they already made the first one. They're going to make a blockbuster movie, a national movie about Gideon's promise and the role that it has played in ending mass incarceration and creating a criminal justice system that actually deserves to have the word justice in the title. A system that restores community and reduces harm without causing all of these toxic consequences of our current system. And when they make that movie, John, Illy, I'll be in the front row, popcorn in hand, cheering you on. Thank you.